Hey everybody. So there's been a lot of talk recently about quarantining and quarantining your fish and how do you quarantine and all that. And I've seen some people mention, oh, well, I just picked up these cherry barbs and I'm going to quarantine them for 4 weeks, and I'll quarantine them in this tank right here with these denison barbs and the pleco and all those. Well, okay, that could be a quarantine, sort of. But then I'll also hear the people say, well, I'm quarantining for 4 weeks and the denison barbs are in quarantine also. Okay. But the denison barbs will come out of quarantine next week. But the cherry barbs have quarantine for 4 weeks because they just started. That's not quarantine. That's not how that works. What you're doing isn't really a quarantine. Quarantine means to keep alone, to not let others come in contact with it. So, can you quarantine a fish with other fish? Yes. But when you introduce, let's say the cherry barbs, the new fish, into the quarantine system that other fish are in, well, the other fish, the denison barbs in this example, aren't at the end of their quarantine anymore because they've had something else introduced to them. So they would either not be quarantining or they will need to restart their quarantine period, because that's kind of the point of a quarantine, is you don't want to introduce anything to them and you don't want anything to leave from them. So by introducing the cherry barbs, you have contaminated potentially contaminated the denison barbs quarantine, or potentially given the cherry barbs something from the denison barbs, because you don't know what either one of them has. So, do you have to medicate when you quarantine? Not necessarily. That's not what quarantining is. Quarantining is keeping it by itself. Nothing in, nothing out. The best way to do it, in my opinion, is not to do it in a display tank. You don't quarantine in your main tank. You don't quarantine in a display tank. The only time that you could really do that is if it's a new setup and that's the only thing that's going to be in there right then, and you're just going to put that one group of fish in there and just watch it. And a lot of times that's what people do, is they set up their quarantine tank and that becomes a long-term home for those fish. But the best way to do it is to get a smaller tank, say like this 10-gallon here. So probably on the video it looks a lot bigger because the 10-gallon's closer and the 55 is further behind me. But you get a smaller tank and you put your new fish in that, or if you're you don't have to just quarantine because it's new. You can quarantine because you think it may be ill or injured or something like that. So you put the quarantining fish in the smaller tank, and that would allow it to be able to be observed easier and to be isolated from the other fish. You don't introduce any more fish. You don't introduce external factors. Medicating, that's a personal preference. Personally, I think medicating is, if you're doing it for no reason, if there's not a reason to medicate, you can do more damage by medicating than if you don't medicate at all. Because if you do, say, an antibacterial medication, then you're killing the good bacteria that's in there. Any bacteria that are in there that come in contact with that antibacterial medication could build up a tolerance to the antibacterial medication, and in the long term, that particular medication wouldn't work anymore. But you want to quarantine the fish. Different people say different lengths of time. Most illnesses will show themselves in about 2 weeks, and that's where a lot of the pet stores, they're getting away from it now, but they used to do 14-day guarantees, was because illnesses will show up in the first 14 days usually if they've had something existing. That's part of one of the reasons that they did that. So 2 weeks is a good time period. If you want to be extra safe, you can go 4 weeks. Really, if you just do a week, you might catch about half of it. But a lot of us are impatient and don't want to wait the 2, 3, 4 weeks for quarantining. So what do you have in your quarantine tank? That's really up to you. Personally, I suggest setting it up to make the fish comfortable. So kind of like you would a regular tank. I believe in substrates, so I would put a simple substrate, a sand substrate, a gravel substrate, depending on which fish I'm putting in there. Some sort of substrate, because I might overthink it, but I'm thinking a bare bottom tank has a potential to stress fish out more because they can see stuff moving around below them, potentially lights below them, reflections below them, and you don't want to introduce any more stress into the quarantine tank than what the fish is already dealing with. Some decorations, like hiding spots and stuff for the fish. You want them to have cover and feel comfortable, but you don't want anything that could potentially introduce other pathogens or something like that in there. You don't want anything like extra sharp that they could get hurt or injured on. And then, of course, if your particular fish needs it based on your ambient temperature in the room, your climate and all that, a heater if it needs that, a filter, and you want your filter to be on a separate system. You don't want to run through a system of your water goes through your quarantine tank and into your main display tank and into your other tank, because then it's not quarantine, nothing in, nothing out. So a sponge filter is usually a good system for filtration on a quarantine tank. Other methods, you've got under gravels, you've got internal power filters, you've got hang on the back filters, just some sort of filtration. And different fish will like different types of filtration. And I like to provide the fish a light cycle. It's not necessary for most fish, but I believe fish appreciate a day and night cycle just to kind of get them used to it in their lives for our hobby. And also, I know I'd kind of go crazy if the sun never came up or if it stayed up all the time. But that's kind of just the rundown of quarantine. Most people don't know what a quarantine really is. They think it's just sticking it in a tank and watching it, or sticking it in a tank and dosing it with heavy meds. But quarantine really means nothing in, nothing out. You set it by itself, and it can be by itself as a single fish or as a group of fish. And if you do a 4-week quarantine, nothing in, nothing out for those 14 days. So that also means when you're doing your water changes, don't use your same siphon or python or whatever on your quarantine tank that's used on your other tanks, because that will cross-contaminate. Same thing with buckets, pumps, nets. If you stick your hand in this tank, don't pull your hand out and stick it directly in the other tank, because you can cross-contaminate. And just because you don't see a parasite or an illness on the fish in the quarantine doesn't mean it doesn't have something, and vice versa. Your display tank may have something that you don't realize it, and by taking even the smallest water droplet from this tank to your quarantine tank, you can contaminate your quarantine tank and cause more issues that way also. So it's a good idea to have a dedicated set of tools for your quarantine tank. Its own bucket, if you use buckets, its own net, its own water siphon, all that stuff. And that's a good point, is not to cross-contaminate between your quarantine tank and other tanks. And you can have multiple quarantines run at the same time. Say I picked up the Denison barbs. I put them in this tank to quarantine. And then the next week or two, I go and pick up some cherry barbs. I don't want to stick them in the same quarantine tank here. I'll need a second quarantine tank to quarantine them, or wait and not pick them up until I have my quarantine tank free. But yeah, I believe that's the gist of quarantining. Separate tanks, separate tools, keep the fish separate. I say nothing in, nothing out. You don't add fish to it. You don't take fish out to put in the main tank until your quarantine is complete. The water and tools don't come out of this tank and go into another tank. Tools from that tank don't go into this one. It's its own separate thing. And the key there is to monitor your fish. And that way you can see, is it acting differently? Is it showing dots, spots, lumps, odd colorations, anything like that? And it can be used for new fish coming in. It can be used for fish that need to be separated for one reason or another. If they're ill, they're injured, maybe they're a live bear that's expecting, you can use your quarantine tank for that. Quarantine is just pulled away from all the others. So do you quarantine? Most of us don't quarantine the way that we're supposed to. Maybe that's because we don't understand quarantining. What's your thoughts on quarantine? Is it beneficial? How long do you quarantine for? Give me some information about your thoughts on quarantine and your methods for quarantining in the comments below. It's an opportunity for a great discussion, and I like to see what other people are thinking about it. And if you like this type of stuff, give me the thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't. If this isn't your type of video, give me the thumbs down, let me know why and what you would like to see in the comments below. And we'll see you next time.